Coming up next here on the Metal Command podcast, Steve, Zetro, Souza, and Exodus have parted ways. I review Udo Dirkschneider's re-recording of Balls to the Wall. I revisit Megadeth and the album Rust in Peace. And I talk about the new Avantasia song Against the Wind, which will appear on their upcoming album, Here Be Dragons. All of that coming up next here on the Metal Command podcast.
You are listening to the Metal Command podcast.
Greetings and welcome back to the Metal Command podcast. Tony here with you on this wonderful January 20th, 2025. And I have a lot to get to and a lot to talk about. But first, I do want to thank anybody who supports the show. And if you are on YouTube, please, by all means, if you like what you see and hear on this channel, please subscribe to the channel. Hit that little bell to be notified anytime I do post a video. And if you are following me on any other form of social media like Facebook or Instagram or any of those, by all means, give me a like and a follow there. Have a lot to talk about. And a lot has happened over the past week, and there's so much stuff to get to. So I listened to the re-recorded version of Balls to the Wall. Udo Dirkschneider, with his solo band, decided to bring in a bunch of guests and re-record that album. And it kind of added a little bit of uniqueness to that. I'm going to revisit Rust in Peace by Megadeth. I have a reason as to why I'm going to do that. The new Avantasia song is out, Against the Wind. I'm really actually digging that quite a bit. And I'm going to start off with talking about some news that I really was a little bit disappointed in. That would be Exodus and their singer, now former singer, Steve Zetro Souza, parting ways. Let me read the press release first before I really get into why I'm disappointed and, where I stand on this whole thing. Let's read their press release. I mean, it was a very brief post. I saw the post about 5 minutes after they put it up, but let's read what they put on their Facebook page. And it reads as follows. Exodus have parted ways with Steve Zetro Souza. We thank Steve for his years fronting the band and all of the killer music we made during that time. We wish him only the best in the future and much success with anything he does. And please help us welcome Rob Dukes back to Exodus. We are beyond stoked to have Rob back, ripping it up on stage with us, and he's looking forward to crushing everything like only he can. Next chapter begins. New record rolls along as planned, and the beatings will continue. See you soon, Exodus. Okay. First of all, my first reaction when seeing that was disappointment. Not because Rob Dukes is coming back to the band, but because Steve Zetro Souza, who in my opinion is the voice of Exodus and adds so much to the uniqueness of the band, is now gone. So, here's the thing. I've been following Exodus for over 30 years. And for me, personally, anything that the band has ever done from 2003 on, like when they made their comeback with Temple of the Damned to the present day, everything they have done has pretty much turned to gold. Like, in the early days, I love Bonded by Blood. And folks, Exodus is my favorite thrash metal band of all time. Just want to kind of throw that out there. If it weren't for Bonded by Blood, this show probably wouldn't exist in the way that it does. But I grew up listening to Steve sing in that band. I've been, I'm older than I look. Pleasures of the Flesh, Fabulous Disaster was the first album that I ever bought by them. Impact is Imminent. I think it's a better album than people give it credit for. Or, I think it's better than what people say it is. And then Force of Habit, was it an okay record? Yeah, but Impact is Imminent and Force of Habit are obviously the two weakest records. But from 2003 on, Exodus has pretty much kicked ass And when I think of thrash metal bands, like the old school bands coming back, like the early 2000s, like a lot of these bands started really making records again. The three bands, in my opinion, over the last, let's say 15, 20 years that have been the most consistent and have put out the best material, I would say it's Exodus, Death Angel, and Overkill. Those three bands have just put out a streak of phenomenal records. Now, I am highly disappointed that Steve is not with the band. I have no problem with Rob Dukes. Rob Dukes did a pretty solid job when he was in the band. A lot of people, if you look at their website and a lot of the comments, and you look at the comments around social media, a lot of people are really not happy about Zetro leaving, but they're not out there like utterly protesting Rob Dukes either. I mean, pretty much most people accepted him. But I'm going to tell you what the difference is between the two of them. They're both great frontmen. There's no question about that. Are they competent vocalists? Yes. But the difference between Rob Dukes and Zetro is very simple. Rob Dukes sounds like your everyday, run-of-the-mill, hardcore vocalist. And he does a very good job with that style of singing. Steve Zetro Souza, on the other hand, is far more unique, and Steve singing over the music that Gary writes is one of the most unique things, not only in thrash metal, but in the heavy metal scene in general. And when you take Steve away from that music, it loses some of its uniqueness. It just does. So I'm not saying Rob Dukes is a terrible vocalist. He's not. But the thing is, he doesn't bring anything new or exciting to the band. There are a lot of people that sing a lot like him that you could throw in there, and to me, there wouldn't be that much of a difference. But when Steve came back, there was a huge difference. That uniqueness came back. And that is the biggest difference, and that is why I'm disappointed Steve is not with the band. Now, I get why they bring Rob back. Everybody that's been a fan of Exodus knows who he is. Most people generally accepted him. It's not like you don't have a bunch of people going out and saying, oh my God, no Zetro, no Exodus. Because clearly the main reason most people listen to Exodus, and the main reason I listen to them, is Gary Holt's songwriting. But Steve just added something to that songwriting that Rob Dukes does not. Rob does a good job. The three albums he sang on with Exhibit A, Exhibit B, and of course, Shovel-Headed Kill Machine, which all three of those records are phenomenal. Exhibit A is probably one of my top 2 Exodus albums. But he's not Steve. And that's really where I'm going with that. I want to tell you a funny Steve Zetro Souza story of when he came on my radio show. So, Zetro came on my show for the first time when he formed the band Hatriot. Now, mind you, I grew up listening to this guy, so I was super excited to have this guy on my show. And I can tell you, I've had him on my show a couple times with Hatriot, and then he came on my show a couple times, my radio show, when he rejoined Exodus. And absolutely cool dude. Exodus and Steve, and this applies to Steve too, one of the most fan-friendly metal bands out there. Like, if you're going to pay for a meet and greet, that is the band you want to pay the meet and greet price for, because they are that cool with their fans. You see a genuine appreciation from that band towards their fans. That would go for everybody that's in the band. And Steve was like an ambassador in that sense. But I talked to him, absolutely incredible guy to talk to. Met him once. They came here to Cleveland, about 10 years ago when they were opening for Slayer. Gary was kind of doing double duty. And just an incredible dude. Really cool guy. But I'll tell you a funny story. So the first time I had ever talked to him, when I was doing the radio show, I would ask for a station ID. One of those IDs where you say, hey, this is Steve Souza from, Hatriot or Exodus. and you're listening to, yada, 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 one of those. I forgot to do it. In all honesty, I literally forgot to ask him to do that. So knowing that I forgot to ask him to do that, I found his page on Facebook actually back then. And I messaged him. I told him the situation. Dude's like, call my number. I called him on his cell phone, and he did the station ID for me. He actually set a time for me to call him. He did it. But the fact that the guy took time out of his day for somebody he really doesn't know that well to do something like that was easily one of the coolest things somebody has ever done on my show. Like, I know if I were to ask like 90% of the musicians out there that I've ever interviewed, most of them would, they would probably say no. But Steve was cool. He said yes. He called me. He actually ended up calling me back. I gave him my cell phone number. Really cool dude. Just a guy that was a great frontman. And to me, one of my top 2 or 3 frontman in Exodus. And that's the thing. You can't really replace him. Like, if Rob Dukes left Exodus and they weren't going to get Zetro back, you can get a lot of guys that sound like Rob and put them in that position. But you really can't duplicate Zetro. You just can't. The closest thing you could probably do is his son Cody, who sings in Hatriot. Sounds a lot like Steve. You could probably put him maybe in that category. He sounds similar. Some people have always said that Zetro sounds similar to Blitz from Overkill. They kind of got a somewhat similar voice, but not really. Zetro is just that unique. And Zetro, with Gary's awesome songwriting, is what I am going to miss from the band. Now, am I excited for the next Exodus album? Absolutely. It's Gary Holt, folks. I mean, the guy is a phenomenal guitar player and just writes, again, my favorite thrash band of all time. There's a reason for that. Gary is my biggest reason why I listen to Exodus. But here's the difference. When I listen to an album like Exhibit A or Exhibit B or Shovel-Headed Kill Machine, all 3 of which are brilliant records, I'm listening to that for Gary's awesome songwriting. Rob's vocals are okay. They're good. But when I listened to Exodus with Steve Zetro Souza in the band, I listened to those records to hear Gary and his songwriting and Steve's vocals on top of that songwriting. Because that combination is one, as I said before, one of the most unique things in thrash metal and in the heavy metal scene itself. So I think Exodus loses a little bit without Steve. I'm good with Rob, and it makes sense too. You bring the guy back that you know. You bring a guy back that pretty much most of the fans accept. And then you don't have to get to know a new vocalist. You don't have to break somebody in. You don't have somebody nobody's ever heard of. And then you don't have to listen to these questions of why, like, who is this guy? What does he sound like? You don't have to listen to that. We already know what Rob sounds like. So, in a sense, if you're going to replace Steve, I'm glad they picked him. And again, it's not a slight at Rob Dukes. I mean, a guy's a good frontman. I've seen them live with him. He's just not a unique vocalist compared to Steve. And that's really mainly what I'm saying. Now, a lot of people are speculating, what happened? Why did they part ways? Folks, I can tell you that anytime something happens behind the scenes, you're just going to get a generic press release. Nobody will ever give you the full story. Most of us weren't there. I mean, I'm sure there are people that know what happened, but again, we could sit here and speculate for hours. But the bottom line is, as somebody like myself who has witnessed members parting ways with bands firing people, people leaving a band, you'll never get the full story, folks. And in many cases, not all, a lot of times these parting of the ways are amicable. But if they are not amicable, and again, I know nothing about what happened with their situation, but if the situation isn't amicable, most likely you don't want to know the story because you would be highly disappointed in your heroes. You know that old adage where they say, you don't want to meet your heroes, you'll be disappointed. In a lot of cases, you would be if you knew the real story of what happened behind the scenes in pretty much almost every band you listen to. Now, it doesn't apply to everybody. And certainly, I have no idea what happened in this situation. There's so many things that could have happened. But the bottom line is, Steve isn't there. I'm disappointed. So are a lot of people. Actually, a majority of people are disappointed with it. But that same majority of people, I would say pretty much almost all of them, are okay with Rob. Because we've heard Rob before. We liked the albums he sang on. And it's really not going to affect the quality of the album, in my opinion. Again, Atrocity Exhibition, Exhibit A, Atrocity Exhibition, that is probably, it's pretty close to my favorite Exodus album. It's tough. It's between that and Tempo of the Damned. And again, everything that, in my opinion, that Exodus has done since 2003 has been phenomenal. Persona non grata was a great record. It's probably in my top 3, maybe 4. And when I say everything from 2003 on is the best stuff they've ever done, Rob sang on 3 of those albums. So that's where I stand. Disappointed there's no Steve Zetro Souza in Exodus. Hopefully, maybe he might join another project or another band, maybe. Who knows? If he were to bow out and stop doing music altogether, he's made his mark. But to be honest, I'm going to miss him in that band. Okay. Let's move on to the next subject. Let's move on to something more positive right now, because I just ranted about my favorite thrash metal band of all time. Let's talk about one of my favorite bands and singers out there, Tobias Sammet, obviously from Edguy and Avantasia. Avantasia has an album coming out next month in February. And there's a new song called Against the Wind. Now, the first single, Creepshow, very typical of one of his singles. Against the Wind is a pretty typical power metal song. Now, the one thing about Avantasia and, Toby's songwriting is that he can take that old school epic power metal sound and still make it sound great. And when you listen to stuff that he writes with Avantasia, it never gets old. It never gets boring. Like when I listen to this song Against the Wind, it is like one of the most perfect power metal songs I've ever heard. It's got the epic feel to it. It's got a lot of trademark elements to it. That is just a trademark of Tobias Sammet. I probably think the song sounds a little bit more like an Edguy song than Avantasia, but it's still very, very good. Catchy chorus, kind of a more upbeat track, but it's really not much different than what you would expect from Avantasia or expect from Tobias Sammet. And to be honest with you, I know it sounds like I'm saying it's just like everything else he's done, but the thing is, everything else he's done has been great. So I'm listening to these two songs. When he had the last Avantasia album come out, mostly the singles, again, were pretty much what you would expect. And they're very straightforward, straight to the point. Anytime that they release a lyric video or a single, when I listen to the album is so much better than the singles they put out. But I understand why they put these songs out as singles. What do you expect from Avantasia? You expect epic power metal, right? Against the Wind is a classic sounding epic power metal song. It really is. Creep Show sounds a lot like the style of a very straightforward song, not very long. And those tend to always be the singles for Avantasia. Seriously. So I'm excited for Here Be Dragons. You don't get a lot of really awesome classic power metal being played the way it should be played and played well. It just doesn't happen. Avantasia, obviously a new album coming out. Halloween's going to have an album coming out. The new Labyrinth album, I think, is good. So there's a lot of great power metal that's going to come out this year. You know, we already have the new Gravedigger album that just came out. Brainstorm's got an album coming out next month. So just so much cool stuff coming out. But Avantasia, you know, everybody always talks about why doesn't he do an Ed Guy? Why doesn't he do an Ed Guy album? I always hear this constantly on social media. Like, why isn't he doing this? To be honest with you, Ed Guy sort of evolved into what Avantasia is now. Much like I always say, Sabotage pretty much evolved into Trans-Siberian Orchestra. And that's kind of what happened with Ed Guy. The last Ed Guy album, Space Police, was great. Actually, I would probably consider it one of the top 5 albums they've ever put out. But you have 2 projects with overlapping material. I've always said it's always best to concentrate on one band, one project. Like I mentioned Brainstorm earlier, right? When Simforce broke up and Andy Frank just started focusing completely on Brainstorm, if you go and listen to the album that they put out, I don't remember which record it is, but if you listen to the music they've been putting out ever since Simforce broke up, it's 10 times better than most of the stuff they had ever put out. And that's because you are putting your energy into one project. I think one of the things, too, that happens in metal scene especially is, you know, back in the old days, you had one band and that's all you did. You concentrated completely on that one band. But now, because money is spread thin in the music scene, people are in like 20 projects, 10 projects, 5 projects, always doing guest appearances. What I like about Avantasia is Toby is pretty much strictly doing just that. And I think that is where you see the strength in the songwriting, in the production, and why these Avantasia albums are as good as they are. Personally, what Toby has done with Avantasia since, 10, 11, 12 years ago is much better than the early stuff. And the reason being is he's concentrating on one project. They have a lot of tour dates booked. I saw you can go to their Facebook page for that. But the new song is great. It's old school, classic power metal, done the right way. Really not anything unexpected on it. But typically when you listen to some of the other kind of cool elements that he will add into his music, that usually happens when the album comes out. You'll discover a lot of cool stuff. The singles are pretty straightforward and pretty cut and dry. Okay, folks. Well, coming up next after the break, I'm going to talk about Udo Dirkschneider's Balls to the Wall, the re-recorded version of it. Very interesting, by the way. I did get to listen to that over this past week. And I'm going to revisit Rust in Peace by Megadeth. And I'm going to tell you why here after the break. The Metal Command Podcast will be back right after this.
Thanks for watching. Please hit the subscribe button, hit the little bell, you can see this program on any of our social media. Please give me a follow there. Again, I always appreciate your.
Okay, back here on the Metal Command Podcast. Tony here with you again. And let's talk about Udo Dirkschneider. And Udo Dirkschneider is releasing another album. It is called Balls to the Wall Reloaded. Basically a re-recorded version of the Balls to the Wall album originally put out by Accept in the early 80s. So I had a chance to listen to this. Now, anytime bands talk about re-recording an album, it's probably a 50-50 shot whether I'm really going to like the re-recording, and probably even lower than that as to whether I will like the re-recording better than the original. Most of the time, I like the original better, and most of the time, it's a 50-50 shot whether I think the re-recording is great. And to be honest with you, so many bands have done this now. Anytime I hear about, we're going to re-record an entire album, it's kind of like I take that with a grain of salt. I don't really get uber super excited over it. It just doesn't really do anything for me when a band announces that. I always find it interesting when bands do this because sometimes they add some different elements into the music, a lot of subtle stuff. Like when I talked about Iron Savior and Pete re-recording a bunch of their music, mostly because the older albums are unavailable and nobody really knows who owns the rights to them to put those out. He adds some kind of really cool elements that you didn't have in the originals. And in some cases, the originals sound, the re-recorded versions sound better than the originals. So, Udo Dirkschneider, when I first read he was re-recording Balls to the Wall, I'm kind of like, what's the point of doing that? Like you're re-recording an album that you basically recorded with Accept with your solo band. However, when I started reading further down the press release, I realized he did something pretty unique that you don't really see every day. And that is each song has a guest singer. And on top of that, guest singers that are a lot different, who have a much different vocal style than Udo does. So let's go take a look at this list. I'm going to flash this list of singers up here on the screen. Check this out. And look at what we have here. So you go down the track listing, Balls to the Wall, you got Joachim Broden from Sabaton. Very, very good choice, by the way. You have Biff Bifford from Saxon singing London Leather Boys. Mil Petroza from Creator singing Fight It Back. Nils Mohn from Dynasty singing the song Head Over Heels. Losing More Than You Ever Had, featuring Michael Kiske from Halloween. I'm going to get into that a bit because Michael Kiske, obviously a much different styled vocalist than Udo. Got Eva Eriksson of Brothers of Metal singing Love Child. Danko Jones singing Turn Me On. Dee Snider from Twisted Sister singing the song Losers and Winners. Tim Ripper Owens doing Guardian of the Night. And then, of course, Doro Pesch doing Winter Dreams. A pretty good amount of European musicians and German musicians, for that matter. A lot of really great vocalists on here. So, there is not one bad singer on this. And you have a variety of singers singing these songs. So when you listen to the album, Udo sings on these tracks along with these other singers, and they do backing vocals. Now, when I hear guys like Dee Snider or like Tim Ripper Owens or Mil Petroza, when I listen to those names, when I first saw them on this list, I'm kind of like, okay, that makes sense. Those guys have a lot of grit in their voice. They could definitely pull these songs off without a problem. And their takes on these songs were quite interesting. Like Dee Snider, he's got a pretty rough voice, like Udo does. Tim Ripper Owens can definitely hit the lower end of the vocal spectrum, and he has a lot of grit in his voice, and I think his song is great. But where it got interesting for me was hearing people like Biff Bifford from Saxon or Michael Kiske from Halloween singing these songs, because those two guys are two completely different singers than Udo. Now, Biff singing London Leather Boys was actually pretty cool. And then, they'll trade off verses in these songs, and then obviously when the chorus of the song comes up, they're doing backing vocals for each other. Biff's song was interesting, but the most interesting was Michael Kiske. Not really just because I'm a Halloween fan, but it's more or less the fact that he's a more operatic singer, and Udo's just this guy that has a raspy voice and sounds completely the opposite of Michael Kiske. And when I was listening to Michael Kiske singing this song, I was actually quite I was expecting, I'll be honest with you, I like Michael Kiske, one of my favorite singers of all time, really great person, really cool dude, but I'm like, is he really going to sound good on this song? Because he doesn't have a gritty voice like Udo. And to be honest with you, I was quite shocked at how good the song sounded with him. And what was really cool and unique is that when they get to the chorus of the song, obviously Udo's doing the lead vocals in it, but you could hear Michael's voice backing him up. And it sounded really cool. I was really quite surprised how good this actually was. But, when you go down this list of vocalists, all of these guys probably listened to Accept at some point in their lives, or really got into that band, or got into Udo, maybe even toured with him, right? Especially a lot of the German musicians. I'm sure Mil Petroza, being a German guy, you grew up listening to Accept. Doro Pesch, listening to it, probably came up in the scene in the early 80s, probably played shows with Accept, listened to them over the years. And, Michael Kiske, obviously knowing, probably listening to them as well. But I just thought that was an interesting thing. And every singer that was on this album did a great job. So I would tell you that this re-recorded or reloaded version of Balls to the Wall is very, very good. It's not your typical re-recording where they just go and redo the songs and that's it. You have a lot of really great singers, guest singers on this album. I'll be honest with you, it is probably one of the best re-recorded versions of an album that anybody has ever done. Now, the original is obviously a classic. Don't get me wrong. But in my opinion, when it comes to re-recording an album, I'm going to be honest, this is one of, if not the best re-recorded classic album that any band has ever done. And a big reason for this, at least for me, are the guest vocalists. Because you not only brought in a lot of guest vocalists, you brought in a lot of awesome guest vocalists from a lot of really, really great bands. Like, there's nobody on this list of singers where I looked at it and be like, oh, that's going to suck. Was skeptical of a couple of them until I heard the songs. But in general, not only are these songs well recorded, not only does Udo's band play them perfectly, but I just think it was a really great idea to bring so many guests on this album, because Balls to the Wall is probably one of, if not the biggest Accept album that they ever put out, maybe as far as sales, right? And celebrating it, which it feels more like a celebration of that record. I think doing what Udo has done with this, again, one of, if not the best re-recorded version of an album any band has ever done. I got excited. I'll be honest with you. Most of these re-recorded albums, I don't get very excited for them. But with this one, I'll be honest. When I saw the list of singers, I was stoked. Even the ones I was skeptical of. Like, I was eager to hear what this would sound like. So when I finally ended up getting the promo of it and listening to it, it's really cool. I would give this, as far as a re-recording goes, 10 out of 10. Most re-recordings, 7 out of 10, 6 out of 10. Some of them get above that. This is definitely one that's unique because the entire approach to it was perfect. Okay, so moving on to the last segment, I have one more thing to talk about. Rust in Peace by Megadeth. Check it out right here. Got it on vinyl. 180 gram vinyl. The original mix, not the terrible remix that Dave Mustaine did back in like the early 2000s. I'm going to talk about why I'm revisiting this album. And I'm going to be revisiting a lot of classic albums that have come out over the years when it comes to heavy metal. This is definitely one of those albums. So why am I bringing this up? Well, last year, I ended up getting a gift card to a place called The Exchange. The Exchange is a store that sells used CDs, used vinyl, video games, DVDs, Blu-rays, video game systems, lots of cool stuff. And you can also buy new CDs there. They have a great selection of brand new vinyl albums you can buy there from any genre you could probably think of. It is a local business here in the Cleveland, Ohio area. And so I ended up getting a gift card. Now, my son, who is a big heavy metal fan, we both said, hey, let's take our gift cards. Let's go up to the Exchange. Let's go buy an album together. You know, each of us buy a record. Let's go record shopping together. So we did. Ironically, we both bought Megadeth records. He bought the reissue of Killing Is My Business and Business Is Good. Now, I was going through the records, and I'm going through all these albums. There's so many. There's like all these Sabotage reissues in there. There were so many albums in there that I was thinking about getting. I owned a lot of the stuff that was in there. That was another thing. But then I came across this. And I'm like, you know, my son bought a Megadeth record, and this is here. Not only that, but it was under $20, brand new. I'm kind of like, 180-gram reissue of Rust in Peace. Probably one of the most iconic and one of the most influential thrash metal albums of all time. And it might quite honestly be one of, if not my favorite thrash metal album of all time. But it's really, really cool. First of all, it's the original mix. You have the, Capitol Record logo on it, when you take the record out. I mean, it is definitely looks identical to the original pressing of this when this album came out in 1990. But when it comes to Megadeth, the one thing I could always say about Dave Mustaine is that he has always had talented musicians that he has brought into the band. Some are better than others. Typically, some of them are, everyone he's ever brought in has been talented, but sometimes the musical chemistry seems a little bit off. Like, for example, I thought, even though World Needs a Hero was a good album, the chemistry seemed a little bit off between him and Al Pitrelli, and as far as guitar players go, it just didn't seem like it fit. Al Pitrelli's a phenomenal guitar player. The Chris Broderick thing, great player, but he just didn't feel like the best fit for Megadeth. Where I thought Kiko Loureiro and obviously Marty Friedman were the perfect fit, or Chris Poland was the perfect fit. And so I'm revisiting this album because I forgot just how great this record actually was. I hadn't listened to it in a long time. And, when I first bought this reissue, I didn't listen to it right away. I grabbed it, put it down, kind of didn't think about it. When you do a show like mine, you don't really get you get so much new music. You kind of don't go back to the older stuff until like the end of the year and the beginning of the year, because you aren't getting as many electronic press kits and promos and stuff like that. Finally, over the last month, I started really listening to this. I got a brand new setup for listening to vinyl, got a tube preamp going into my very large and powerful stereo. And I listened to this probably almost every day this past month. And it just, I don't know, the new system I have and listening to this record sounded incredible. Now, when it comes to Megadeth albums, I would say almost everybody that I know thinks, pretty much everybody will go back and say Rust in Peace is probably their best album. Not everybody. Some people think Peace Sells is the best album. But when it comes to Megadeth, for me, Rust in Peace is my favorite album, hands down. The lineup on this album, in my opinion, is the best lineup Dave Mustaine ever had. And most Megadeth fans would agree with you. They would say, the Marty Friedman, Nick Menza, David Ellefson, Dave Mustaine lineup is the best lineup the band ever had. Not saying the other ones haven't been good. I think Kiko Loureiro is probably, we haven't heard the new guitar player yet on an album, Tamu Montessori, but Kiko, in my opinion, was on par with Marty Friedman. Or he was pretty close. Great guitar player. And the 2 albums he recorded with Megadeth, 2 of the best albums they've ever done. But Rust in Peace is like the gold standard for thrash metal. Probably my favorite thrash metal album of all time. There is not a song on this album that I dislike. The way that they, this pressing, because some vinyl pressings are better than others if you're into vinyl. This pressing sounds incredible. And if you hook it through a 2 preamp like I have going into my stereo, it's even more incredible. But I got to be honest, this re-recorded version, or not re-recorded, but this repressed version on vinyl that they came out with is fantastic. So my question is, folks, if you like Rest in Peace, what's your favorite song? Is it your favorite Megadeth album? Where do you have it ranked in Megadeth's discography? Curious to hear your opinion. And that's pretty much about it, folks. Also, I forgot to mention, they had the Rusted Pieces video compilation, a VHS compilation that came out back then. I had all the band's videos. They had commentary in between each video with the band singing there, the band sitting there between songs, like in a room or a studio, commenting on each specific video. And that came out right around the time this did. So that's it. Folks, thanks for watching. Thanks for your support. Again, if you want to support the show, and I thank anybody that does support the show, please hit the subscribe button. Hit that little bell to be notified anytime I do post a video. And of course, if you are following me on any other form of social media, give me a like and a follow there. With that said, thanks for watching. Stay metal. Thank you for watching and listening to the Metal Command podcast. If you like what you see and hear on this show, by all means, subscribe to the channel. Hit that little bell to be notified anytime I do post a video. And of course, if you are following me on any other form of social media, by all means, give me a like and a follow there. Thanks for watching. Stay metal.